Well, thank you, Christine. And as she mentioned, we encourage you, if you have questions, if you even have the slightest bit of interest, come join us for lunch today. Connect with one of the ladies out at the table after the service. And that's where the journey begins, just by being open, learning, asking questions. Speaking of today's panel, I want to bring up on the platform one of the participants who's going to be sharing with us later this afternoon. He is a Station Hill member, serves in multiple areas of our church, including with our students. You may not know this, but he is the Brentwood Baptist Church video producer. So all of the excellent videos that you see, this guy is behind them all. He's a former missionary, but he is a foster care advocate. His name is Alex Lyons. Will you welcome him to the platform this morning? My brother, thank you for doing this today. So Alex is a product of the foster care system. And so Alex, tell us a little bit, sketch us a picture of what that journey was like for you growing up.
Absolutely. So I never knew my biological dad, and I lived with my biological mom until I was 8, and my mom had a lot of abusive boyfriends in her life, one of which abused me, which thrust me into foster care. I was in foster care from 8 to 21 when I aged out, but would say probably about half a dozen foster homes and half a dozen group homes along the way.
Yeah. So you have walked that journey. So ultimately, help us understand the turning point. What got you from that journey to being here today as a foster care advocate and as a strong believer?
For sure. I would say, as Christine said, I have the blessing, I like to say that I have many moms and many dads. From my first foster mom, who was a Presbyterian choir director, who when I think of maternal love to this day, I still think of her, to being at a Lutheran group home and going to chapel services every Wednesday. But there was a foster family late in my teens who had 7 biological kids of their own and still chose to foster me. And he was a youth pastor, and he brought me to church, and he would say, "Do you know Jesus?" And I was like, "Yeah, I know Jesus. He died on the cross for our sins, la, 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 la." And I spat back everything you're supposed to say, but he dug deeper and chose to ask, "No, do you have a relationship with him?" And I would say there is where I first started my journey with Christ. And then later in college, when I was surrounded with peers, is where I firmed that foundation.
Yeah, praise God. I'm a fan of those youth pastor guys, you know. I haven't been a former one myself, but that's awesome. And it's amazing to see how God's brought you along on that journey and of course, pointed you to the cross of Jesus, which for us is the symbol of what God has done for us. So speaking of the cross, you contacted me not too long ago and said, "Hey, there's a gift that I would like to give to the church at Station Hill, and that gift is a cross." And so here's a picture of where it was originally located, but tell us the story behind this cross.
Absolutely. So this cross is a cross that was in a Lutheran orphanage. The Lutheran orphanage began in the 1800s. The cross was installed sometime in the 1960s when it was transitioned to what is called a group home now. The cross is a mosaic cross that has a lot of dings and a lot of kids who have picked stuff off along the way because, kids get a little crazy, cray-cray sometimes. So, but to me, this is the cross that every Wednesday for 4 years that I was in a chapel service, and with my gold hardcover Good News Bible, I would learn about how God is the father to the fatherless, how God is a God who puts the broken to families, the God who grafts us into his families. He's adopted us. I can preach, but I'm going to leave that to you.
Go right on, man. You're rolling. Well, here's what's so cool to me. So Alex wants our church to have this cross. And so it is going to be an enduring symbol of our commitment as a church family to these vulnerable children. It's out right now behind the missions table. We'll find a permanent home for it. But I do love that it's a mosaic, because that mosaic represents the fact that it takes a lot to care for vulnerable kids. It takes people who are willing to adopt and foster. It takes people who are willing to give and support and provide respite care. It takes people who are willing to provide resources. It takes the church in order to point these kids to Christ. And so I love that gift, and I love that we're gonna have a permanent home for it. And speaking of the cross, Alex has developed, he's a creative, he has developed a creative way of being able to communicate and share his testimony of what ultimately led him there. It's a spoken word testimony, and so I wanted him to share that with you today before we get into the 4th chapter of Galatians. So pray for Alex as he shares with us his compelling and powerful testimony today in spoken word.
Can you imagine? Can you for a second lend me your mind's eye? Visualize these words as a story of what can come from the dust, what can come from love, what can come from trust. A faith so tiny mountains can be moved, a faith that was shaken when I was removed. For a moment, I recall a tale of a young lad, surrounded by those who doubted and misunderstood, his acting outward isn't his longing to be bad, but his aching need for something good. From home to home, the journey be unknown, surrounded by faces, but still feeling alone. From home to home, alone with his trash bag of belongings. In his hand, he carried a dream that he fostered up belonging. The revolving door of sleeping on group home floors, until he was floored by the one who he knew would never leave or forsake. Which each family he encountered, he was sculpted, molded, made. See, even those who wander off are never lost. We keep trekking because the prize at the end is full of the glory promise, with many caseworkers, volunteers, mentors, and fathers found because open arms stay waiting, a plan and two hands built for creating. See, even Jesus lived in a house that wasn't his home, was fostered and loved, and when he was grown, he fostered us in his image and gave life to the earth. And through his healing sacrifice, he gave our lives worth